Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? This week we have indications that the CCP virus may have been spreading much earlier than initially thought. The use of novel mRNA techniques in developing vaccines against other viruses, particularly those that take advantage of spike proteins. Nightmare fuel where spiders feast upon snakes and other creatures. One of the longest-lasting space-based telescopes, the Hubble telescope, is currently offline due to a computer malfunction. These and other news items can be found in the timestamps in the description below. Let's start with the CCP virus. It's generally accepted to have started somewhere around November 2019, possibly as early as October 2019. From here, within 6 months, it had infected every continent and every country on Earth. It's led to a mortality rate greater than 3.9 million, more than 180 million cases, and this will continue to grow despite vaccination efforts to stop its spread and infection. Looking at this from a pure epidemiological point of view, having such an explosion in such short order would normally require a much larger pool of initially infected individuals. Think of it as an initial booster. More people infected means it can spread and grow that much quicker. It's one of the reasons why the October to November timeframe for it to begin has been questioned. This is where the application of a existing model from conservation science comes in, something called the optimal linear estimation. Researchers from the University of Kent applied this. The technique has normally been used to try and figure out when a species went extinct, based on their reported sightings and the last reported sighting. This is also useful in this case though, to try and figure out when the disease first appeared. You can, in theory, extrapolate out of the data just when a disease first shows up based on the frequency and nature of the observations made of its occurrence. This is, of course, extrapolation and based to some degree on theory. It is, in many respects, a form of extrapolation very similar to what's used in statistics to try and explore data outside the known and established sample set. It's not going to be perfect, but depending on how strong the data is, it can be very reliable. In fact, based on the various countries involved, they're able to make an estimation on when diseases first arrived in certain locations. As has been noted, November's the generally accepted mid-time frame, with more likely expectations of December for first appearances in China. This study says it could be as early as very early in October, first showing up in Japan in early January, Thailand about the 7th of January, to Spain on the 12th, South Korea on the 14th of January, and making its way to America only a few days later. This drastically changes many of the timelines that we currently have for the spread of the CCP virus. The spread of the CCP virus is one significant thing to be aware of, but as continues to be a concern, there are lasting effects from infection. Those millions of deaths aren't the only worry. The millions of survivors who have been infected have lasting harm, and that lasting harm ranges from slight damage to the respiratory system, where they may not be as fit as previously, through to serious heart damage, and even going so far as long-term, permanent brain damage. And it's this last one that's proving to be particularly notable. Data coming out of the UK Biobank would indicate that survivors have a loss of grey matter over time, even after infection. This degree of damage may be very similar to what is seen in conditions like Alzheimer's and dementia in extreme cases, and much less severe in others. The data comes out of 782 volunteers, who all had brain scans done. These were before the pandemic, and then they had brain scans done after the pandemic, or at least after their infection and resolution of it. The participants were divided into two cohorts, 394 who had the CCP virus and 388 who were otherwise healthy. Those who had been infected had a loss of grey matter. While it has yet to be peer-reviewed, this would match with other observational findings from clinical practice. That is, long-term, notable neurological dysfunction. It also further supports past research which found that there was long-term damage, increasing the chances of stroke and dementia-like symptoms. Given the size of the study and the nature of it, it is at least somewhat more reliable and reputable, although it will be interesting to see what peer review has to say about their methodologies and findings in the end. Next is news on the virus itself, and we won't be talking about the current theory that it is lab-derived, but rather about research into its genome in general. Much of the genetic research done today uses only a handful of techniques. This primarily owes to the reliability, ease, and cost-effectiveness of the methods. The same techniques can to an extent be used to analyze what's going on in a genome. This is where analysis comes into play of that genome sequence. Seattle researchers have found 13 partial sequences from some of the earliest cases of the CCP virus. These sequences don't make sense as a partial sequence. As such, it stands to reason that these partial sequences are much more interesting than would otherwise have been the case. The reason for this isn't the current theories about its leak, but rather the ability to separate out when the virus developed and where it developed. For example, early virus sequencing can rule out an attachment to the Wuhan wet food market. That's because these viruses and their genome occur before and outside of that market. That means that can't have been the location for patient 0. It also makes it that much more easy to begin tracking down the original virus strain, or the progenitor virus. That is what gave rise to all the variants that we're now trying to deal with, to various degrees of success and failure. Unfortunately, this is yet another preprint example of academia, and we're waiting to see how peer review also handles this particular study. The big concerns with it are that there is both incomplete data as the basis for the conclusions reached, but also a surprising amount of missing data from certain databases that were originally sourced from China. That's a concern in and of itself. Going now from the CCP virus itself, but instead to the use of mRNA vaccines, and in this case, specifically the use of mRNA vaccines against the chimeric spike proteins. These are the same structures that the CCP virus is using to get into the human body and take it on as a host. The way they're developing this particular mRNA vaccine is that it develops a spike protein that isn't entirely specific to just one strain of the CCP virus or other SARS-based viruses. Rather, it takes attributes from several different parts of it, merges them all into one, and creates a vaccine which could, in theory, deal with many different variants of the virus. This is a particularly notable development and an area of great concern when it comes to vaccines. It has been a worry that the new variants could, in theory, be able to evade the immune system based on the current vaccines available, and clinical observations seem to support that with some vaccines. Others appear to be unaffected by the current variants, although with any virus given enough time there will be many mutations to come. The idea with this is to create a single vaccine that carries a duplicity of different spike protein areas that the immune system could find, take out of the spike protein, and use to start generating the immune response. But it's a multifaceted immune response looking at different parts of the spike protein, thereby being able to simultaneously target and deal with multiple variants of the CCP virus. This provides a broad and efficacious immunity that doesn't require boosters immediately and can, at least in theory, create a better protection than what is currently available. Going now from anything virus or disease related to the stuff of nightmares. Studies into spiders eating snakes. Two things most people have some trouble with, and here they are fighting each others with the 8-legged creepy crawly creatures more often than not winning. The researchers looked at records of spiders killing and then eating snakes. There were about 319 examples that they could find. 297 were events in the wild. This is the vast majority. 22 were, for some odd reason, staged in captivity. There were about 30 spider species responsible for this particular form of behavior, and 11 of those were only observed in captivity. That still leaves 19 species that are active in unusual ways out in the wild. Fortunately, only a few species were responsible for a large number of these observed events, the majority of them being widow spiders. A further 10% by tarantulas and about 9% by large orb-weaving spider species. Although the vast majority of the snakes subject to being eaten were juveniles weighing a fraction of a gram, there were instances of very large snakes, some up to a meter in length and weighing several hundred grams. After seeing just how horrifying the spiders truly are, you might wish to look away, and instead you might turn your eyes to space. Unfortunately, at the moment, humans and astronomers as a whole are rather blind in space, with the Hubble telescope being offline. Its computer has somehow shut down, and at present NASA is desperately trying to fix it. Since the 13th of June, the payload computer shut down, and engineers are trying to figure out just what they can do to make it run. This computer is what helps with running the Hubble telescope, ensuring that its lenses are in the right position, it's facing the right way, controlling the instruments, and so on. Without that, you don't really have a functional telescope. So far, every effort to revive the aging telescope has been very unsuccessful. This should not come as any surprise for anyone familiar with the Hubble telescope. It was first launched in 1990, and it's now been active for over 30 years. Most equipment in space isn't expected to last anywhere near that long. It's already had a number of failures which have been worked around, let's say. It's also been about 12 years now since the last time it was serviced in any significant manner. For all intents and purposes, it is not necessarily obsolete, but no longer supported, much like Windows 7. Much like Windows 7, the Hubble telescope is a beloved relic of the past, and every effort's being made to keep it running, but the chances of that happening are not bleak, but not great either. In other space news, China's version of the ISS has now been crewed. The first astronauts have arrived, and they will begin one of the longest crewed missions to date on their version of the ISS. China has been deploying its own equipment, own astronauts, and more into space over the last few years. Development of a space station of their own was the next logical and inevitable step, a necessity before they began deploying and setting up their own moon base. The final news item for this week regards another space-based item, but also related to day-to-day life on Earth. Starlink's internet infrastructure on homes in America has begun overheating. For the most part, it's a relatively mundane concern compared to some of the other things that could be occupying people's minds. But what they're doing, very simply, is having their dish overheat and then causing it to shut down. This is not something unusual. Phones can do the same thing if they get too warm or too cold for that matter. Your microwave may have something similar. There are plenty of devices that have a thermal shutdown. It just so happens that the internet is so central to many people's lives that when it does occur, it takes them by surprise. The customers reporting this to Starlink's customer support tend to be in areas of America where the weather is incredibly hot, enough so that many of the customers will exceed the 50 degrees Celsius or 122 degree Fahrenheit thermal limitation on the device. Only a few degrees below that and it will turn itself back on. When you look at many of the locations that are considering the use of Starlink, this could be a big concern. There are either areas that have incredibly cold periods or incredibly hot periods. Both of these would likely exceed the capacity of the Starlink infrastructure locally, and that's pretty much going to ruin Starlink's prospectus. If they can't supply the internet services they promise to the most isolated communities, chances are that they're not going to have much more success in more metropolitan locations. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.